a great pleasure to be here addressing you all tonight. I hope you enjoy what I have to say. So, my capable assistant is just going to get the first image.
Okay. Can Vanessa enable sharing, screen sharing?
Yeah, that should be.
Right, yeah. No, I think you're sharing your screen now.
Oh, hang on.
Unless you just want to make me the host, and then
I think make
yes, make me the host, and then I can do it.
Hey, one sec.
We'll get going in a moment.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Can I just say I'm so grateful that Anne's here to sort all this out. I wouldn't know where to start, so she's doing a fabulous job, and I'm very grateful.
And I've got a lovely assistant.
Well,
as
and
well.
indeed husband Paul as well. Yeah, teamwork. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Due to a technical hitch, the very first slide, which is the front cover of my book, has for some reason been squashed up, but not to worry. So what I'm going to be talking about then, obviously, is late Georgian churches, with a kind of a subtitle of New Insights into a Neglected Subject. So architectural history is, at its most basic level, a catalogue of styles that go in and then go out of fashion as they're replaced by new ideas. Indeed, for a group like yours interested in old churches, and indeed modern ones, you will be very familiar with the notion of a succession of styles. Now, through history, almost always the styles that end up being rejected and replaced by something else are rehabilitated by later generations. However, there was one major group of buildings that became unfashionable and has remained firmly in the wilderness ever since, and that is the late Georgian Church of England churches. The crucial question is this: were they really all poor or inept designs? As one might expect, there was a fair share of mediocre ones, but then there are several poorly proportioned Georgian mansions, over-decorated Victorian town halls, unimaginative 1930s libraries, and, dare I say it, some exceedingly dull Victorian churches. So why the almost ubiquitous neglect amongst historians for the late Georgian churches? This was a huge building program, around 1,500 new or rebuilt churches, and it was one that involved just about all the country's architects, including Soane, Cockerell, Smirke, and Nash.
I'm sorry, Christopher, we need to ask people if they can.
That's what people are saying. They haven't got.
Right.
You want to go to start slideshow?
Yes, we had that on. That's what we can see at our end, but so
We can't see it. It's still on home here.
Yes, I know. We've just been down to look on Paul's screen and we can see that. So we're going to have to start. I'm sorry, everybody. We're going to have to. So we've got two of that one.
How's that?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, perfect. Yes, so we can stay with that.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
right.
sorry,
Thank you.
everybody.
So, now, so these roughly 1,500 Anglican churches were the most numerous amongst all major building types during the half century from 1790 to 1840. And for many a community, the new church was its most prominent building and one certainly to be celebrated. So I want to just explore the criticisms for a couple of minutes. Now, the condemnations of these late Georgian churches go back to the early years of Victoria's reign, and with the plaster barely dry on some of them. It was at the beginning of Victoria's reign that these churches and the liturgy for which they were diligently designed to accommodate were condemned by the Tractarians and especially by the ecclesiologists, all highly active from the early 1840s. Can I point out that the cut-off date of 1840 for my talk is not remotely arbitrary. Indeed, by the very early 1840s, Anglican worship was beginning to change significantly. And associated with this revision of worship was a significant change in the design of churches to accommodate it. It's a theme that will run through my talk today. So the ecclesiologists very quickly established themselves as the unquestioned arbiters of what was and was not appropriate for the architecture and liturgy of Church of England worship. The ecclesiologists were intent on literally building on the theology of the Oxford movement to push the Church of England in a higher direction. I'll discuss in a minute what I mean by higher direction. Now, in order to promote their cause, a key weapon in the ecclesiologists' armoury was the denigration of the architectural and liturgical traditions their generation inherited. In particular, right. In particular, they sort of lost my place now. Yes, in particular, they despised the late Georgians' auditory worship, their rational religion, the often restrained services, and they condemned the churches built to contain these services, dismissively referring to them as preaching boxes or sermon houses. Instead, the ecclesiologists wanted higher forms of worship, which meant greater ceremonial and the reintroduction of a number of pre-Reformation liturgical practices. Significantly, all of these were impossible to enact in a typical late Georgian church, which had been thoughtfully designed for auditory worship, as in the image you're looking at now. I'll say more about auditory worship in a couple of minutes. As an alternative to the late Georgian tradition, the ecclesiologists demanded that architects follow medieval precedents in both the layout and the details of their church buildings. Gothic authenticity became the order of the day, and there was certainly no place for a classical design with its pagan connotations. Withering attacks from the ecclesiologists on late Georgian churches regularly included such words as miserable, very objectionable, wretched, and for the worst cases, absolutely wretched. Claiming the ecclesiologists were the first to really understand Gothic, their criticism of earlier examples of style was invariably smug and often vicious. I quote, "In this design, the application of pointed details is such as almost to excite laughter." Now, this church at Brockton by Bromyard was never likely to enthuse the ecclesiologists, but I think it's delightful. But in reaching this conclusion, I'm assessing it from an aesthetic point of view. However, and very importantly, what the ecclesiologists did very effectively was to move the debate about church architecture from stylistic fashion to Christian principles. Although I paraphrase, they were essentially saying, how could you feel content worshipping God in a building like that, i.e. in a building like Brockhampton? And of course, there was no viable answer. Much as I often disagree with the ecclesiologists, I cannot help but admire their ability to develop a line of argument that, quite simply, defied opposition. The ecclesiologists, in fact, were so successful in reorientating the direction of Church of England worship that their revisions linger into the 21st century. Consequently, the late Georgian churches have never had the objective and thorough assessment they deserve from scholars. They have remained firmly in the academic wilderness. As an antidote to ecclesiological attitudes, I'm sure all of you will be rushing out to buy my book, and to tell your appetites, I've selected a handful of topics that I hope you will find interesting. Principally, I want to explore the question of why the late Georgian churches were as they were. In ecclesiological fiction, late Georgian churches were the product of a set of architects.
Andy, I'm just about to leave Driffield, so I'm running really late. Could I call
to
tomorrow?
Understand what a real church looked like. Clearly, this is nonsense.
Yes.
I want to convince you that the late Georgian architects never attempted to design churches of the type the ecclesiologists would have admired, but failed miserably. Instead, I want you to understand that these late Georgian architects were in fact seeking to satisfy a very different set of objectives and very often succeeding admirably. Now, the Victorians also criticised the late Georgians for their parsimony when it came to funding these churches. This too was unwarranted. The late Georgians advocated economy because at a time of a desperate shortage in accommodation, economies made on one church helped fund some other much needed building nearby. In 1817, right in the middle of my period, it was calculated that over 5 million potential worshippers were denied a place in their local church, and the need for additional accommodation was desperate. So, but my next point concerns late Georgian services. One cannot understand
I've heard this before.
late Georgian churches without considering the liturgy for which they were carefully designed. This takes me to a brief examination of auditory worship. Georgian Anglicans had developed a form of worship which was principally auditory rather than sacramental. Now, these terms need unpicking as they're absolutely central to an understanding of late Georgian services and their architectural setting. Auditory worship involved listening and reflecting, and thus, in principle, learning. It implied a passive role for the congregation, but one where its ability to hear was crucial. Conversely, in sacramental worship, which was much closer to Anglican worship in the 21st century and personified by the communion service or Catholic Mass, seeing is at least as important as hearing. Visual effect is fundamental, for instance, processions, clergy in elaborate vestments, clouds of incense, theatrical lighting, and a ritually ornamented altar. In addition, the congregation plays, I'll just go back to the, no. Oh. No, let's see. Oh, never mind. So yes, Catholic Mass. There's the two types of worship, i.e., auditory worship and sacramental worship. These two types of worship made fundamentally different demands on their architects. Crucially, much Victorian opposition to Georgian worship and church architecture was underpinned by endeavours to push worship in a higher, that is, a more sacramental direction. Consequently, late Georgian auditory worship is a mode of worship almost entirely banished by the Victorians and now largely forgotten. And can we come back to the previous one? It's okay. Yeah, thank you. But auditory, auditory worship had a profound influence over many design decisions for the late Georgians. For example, here in remote Fylingdales is an exceptionally interesting example, designed with an emphasis on hearing the vicar as he led the service, not from the altar, but from his pulpit. The seats are focused on the pulpit, and some even have their backs to the altar. Now, the words spoken and the rubrics of all services were clearly set out in the Book of Common Prayer. It was first produced shortly after the Reformation, and most of it is still in use in the 21st century. Thus, there is nothing innovative or radical about the words used in late Georgian services, but what developed through the 17th and 18th centuries was the particular way in which the congregations were led through these services. Auditory worship had evolved from a combination of positive factors, for instance, a renewed emphasis on the teaching function of the clergy, underpinned by practical considerations such as the need for all to hear. Auditory worship also developed for some negative reasons, principally the avoidance of ritual and anything that could be seen as a reminder of Catholic worship. Remember that through the Georgian period, there was widespread hatred and opposition of anything connected with Catholicism. The Anglican liturgical consensus was overwhelmingly for a middle course, avoiding both high church ceremonial and low church austerity, one that steered well clear of both Catholicism and Calvinism. Thus, the architectural vocabulary was needed that emphasised the importance of the pulpit and the role of the church building as an auditorium, without entirely neglecting the symbolic importance of the altar. So let's explore the issues surrounding altars. During the late Georgian period, Holy Communion in most churches was celebrated only 4 times per year and was sparsely attended. However, while the altar was not used for most services, sight of it remained important. The altar was, after all, of considerable importance as a mystical symbol of Christ's sacrifice and Christian redemption. And a dignified altar was one of the principal features that differentiated an Anglican church from a nonconformist chapel. Consequently, while the altar was rarely used, sight of it was an important reminder of belief.
Got rid of the red cabbage.
An arrangement in which all the congregation could hear the words spoken from the pulpit and see the altar was thus the idea.
Look for some olives or something.
And if one wanted to see the altar, putting it at the east end of a long chancel, as the Victorians did, was not always helpful. Far better that the chancel was shallow or merely a recess in the church's east wall, as we see here at St Mary Abbots. Now, how best to reconcile tensions between pulpit and altar? A range of alternatives were tried. Here, the church at St Mary's at Weymouth. Initially, the pulpit was placed in the centre of the church, but was criticised for blocking sight of the pulpit. It was subsequently moved slightly to the right as we see it, but apparently it reduced the acoustic in the church. Another arrangement is this delightful church in Paddington. Originally, the pulpit was right in the middle of the central aisle, almost under that delightful brass candelabra. It was only moved in the 20th century to its present position. This worked very well from an auditory point of view, but caused objections because it blocked sight of the altar. Another novel arrangement here at Tye in Rutland, where the pews are arranged in a college fashion facing north and south. The pulpit and reading desk are at the west end of the church, and the altar is behind the photographer. And the congregants, by merely moving their head one way or the other, can see both the pulpit and the altar very clearly. Here at Walsall, all the seats faced west, which was very good from an auditory point of view, but it meant that all the congregation had their backs to the altar. So the point I'm making is there's some very novel internal arrangements during this period. So what were the basic planning requirements of a late Georgian church? The principal late Georgian services were morning and evening prayers. Services led by a vicar at his desk, probably part of a 3-decker pulpit, which was a substantial piece of furniture from which the whole of these 2 services could be delivered. Ideally, it was centrally placed for maximum auditory advantage, but preferably so as not to preclude sight of the altar. For the infrequently celebrated communion service, there needed to be space in front of the altar for the communicants to gather, but not so much as to make the altar excessively distant for those attending morning and evening prayers. And where music contributed to the service, those providing it needed to be prominently placed, usually in a gallery away from the chancel. Remember, musicians at this time were entirely had an entirely secular status, and placing them away from the altar emphasised their status. Here in Walworth, there was a double gallery. The upper one was used for a choir of charity children. So far as the character of the services was concerned, one senses that the clergy trod a careful path, avoiding what was derisively called enthusiasm at one extreme, something often associated with firebrand, nonconformist preachers, while at the other extreme, avoiding ceremonial. Following this delicate line produced services likely to be decent, well-regulated, comforting, and predictable. According to one contemporary commentator, worshippers enjoyed, I quote, a uniform and sublime devotional service, reverently performed, where they could enjoy that calm reflection and sincere and rational piety which now happily prevail. And clearly, most worshippers were content. So my next theme concerns internal planning. How were the practical demands of auditory worship translated into viable plans for the new churches? A crucial factor in producing a good design involved the study of acoustics. Crucially, how far could a cleric's voice travel? Now, clearly in auditory worship, all the congregation needed to be able to hear the cleric. But you might ask, why did the late Georgians want to build huge churches? Well, quite simply, there was a desperate need for more churches. As I mentioned earlier, in 1817, it was calculated that over 5 million souls were denied a place in their local church. 5 million. And funding for church building was always tight. It was believed that, not unreasonably, one large church cost less to erect than 2 small churches. And 2 small churches needed 2 clergymen, 2 clergy houses, 2 maintenance funds, 2 organists, 2 clerks, etc. One large church, designed so all could hear, was deemed the optimum solution. And here in this image of St Andrew in Plymouth, we see an image designed to accommodate over 2,400 worshippers. And it was very cleverly designed so that all could hear. Some of the architects that designed these churches looked at studies carried out by theatre designers. The most significant one was published in 1790, written by George Saunders. And he calculated that the extent of a speaker to hearer could be 92 feet in front, 75 feet on each side, and 31 feet behind. And these were the dimensions used by the architect John Foulston in his rebuilding of St Andrew in Plymouth, a substantial medieval structure around 180 feet in length. And you can see here in the plan for that church, the way in which the calculations of Saunders intended for theatres has been translated into a church. Specifically in the left hand of those 2 plans, you can see a dotted line, sort of squashed egg shape, which basically is the extent of the Saunders experiments. And Foulston also calculated that by far the best place to put the pulpit was in the middle, but slightly to one end, so that most of, we can, yes, My assistant has just shown me how to, yes. So here we've got the pulpit, and you can see that most of the congregation are in fact in front of it. And this is the dotted line, which shows the extent of Saunders' dimensions. Indeed, there were lots. So a centrally placed pulpit was ideal. There were lots of examples of pulpits initially being placed to one side or other of the centre, but subsequently being moved to a central position to improve the acoustics. The commissioners who distributed the £1 million of the 1818 Church Building Act insisted on a separate pulpit and a separate reading desk, as you see here. But they were by no means always successful in auditory terms. Christopher Wren, writing around 1700, also did some experiments dealing with acoustics, and his research was usefully published in the biography of Wren, written by his grandson and published in 1750. And this was repeated in Elm's biography of Wren, which was published in 1823. So basically the late Georgians had no difficulty in finding out the results of Wren's own research. Wren said, and I quote, "In our Reformed religion," he said, "churches need to be large, but," I quote, "in our Reformed religion, not so large as some congregants cannot hear and see. The Romanists may build larger churches, but ours are to be fitted for auditories, where it will be impractical to accommodate more than 2,000 worshippers." And in his design for St. James, Piccadilly, which Wren believed was the best of his churches, he said it was capacious, beautiful and convenient, and as such, the cheapest of any form I could invent. It had an excellent acoustic, so all could hear. And in order to obtain the maximum, the best acoustic in a church, Wren said that attention needed to be given to the proportions of the plan. You can see in the image, it's almost square. He said that the pulpit needed to be very carefully placed, and we can see here in centrally placed, so that most of the congregation are in front of it. But the other point that he makes is the importance of making sure that the columns were as narrow as possible. I'll return to the issue of slender columns in a few minutes. So the issue of the optimum arrangement to allow all to see and more problematically hear exercised many a late Georgian architect. What was the best size and shape? Now, Wren's plan for St. James Piccadilly, which the published one that you're looking at now, was largely copied by James Gibbs for his St. Martin's in the Field, which was a particularly influential design. Gibbs published the design in his book of architecture that should say 1728, not 1828, I'm sorry. And this was a book which was tremendously influential, and the Gibbs design had a currency well into the 19th century. However, some imaginative late Georgian architects had much more exciting ideas, several of which were built, especially in the 1790s. There were, for instance, circular churches like the St. Chad in Shrewsbury, a particularly fine building, which exists more or less unchanged. And this is the interior of it, an absolutely delightful interior. And you can imagine when it used to have its central pulpit and just how effective it was as an auditorium. There's also a fine circular church in Newcastle, which is still more or less as it was when it was built. There were octagonal churches, here a design published in 1796. One in Wisbech. St Dunstan in the west in London, which still exists almost as you see it here. And this delightful one in Tynemouth in Devon. Sadly, the Victorians changed this by taking out the gallery and reseating it. But I'll return to this later. Interestingly, the roof is supported by the very slender cast iron columns, which support this beautiful skylight. But I'll come back to this design in a little while. And there were a couple of Greek cross examples here at Great Packington, and here St John in Hackney, which still exists more or less as you see it. What about semicircular churches? Now, the well-known advantages of a semicircle, one might expect to have produced a large number of semicircular churches, and certainly architects were well aware of the wonderful acoustics of the ancient Greek and Roman theatres. But in fact, church architects didn't exploit it. I could find only one example of a semicircular church, and that's this one in Hastings, which ironically is now an event space. You can see it works very well as a theatre. There was a design for a semicircular church published by Pocock in 1819, but it seems not to have been followed by the Church of England. But let's return to the Gibbs and Wren plan. Now this appeared in both classical and Gothic examples, a particularly fine classical one in Bristol, or indeed could be made built much more cheaply with the portico reduced to some quite simple pilasters. And the Wren plan could also be translated very easily into Gothic, as we see here in New Mill in Derbyshire. This is the plan of that church, and just from looking at the seating.
Oh, there.
Ah, yes, thank you. You would struggle to know whether it was a Greek or a Gothic example. Or this seems to freeze every so often. And here a particularly fine Gothic example. Now, this leads inevitably to questions of style in ecclesiastical projects. Specifically, which style was the more appropriate for churches, the fashionable Grecian style or the far from fashionable Gothic? However, Gothic had a significant advantage, and it was this. Throughout the late Georgian period, the Church of England faced serious opposition from the various strands of nonconformity. Nonconformity was seen as having a more direct appeal to the working classes, and the nonconformists were remarkably adept at identifying a new congregation and quickly building a chapel to accommodate it. And this was at a time when well-intentioned building initiatives from the Church of England might be constrained by a set of cumbersome regulations that might prevent the erection of a new church. But the Church of England had one powerful tool in its armoury: tradition. Sorry, just bear with me. Yes, that's it. Thank you. Top left. So the Church of England had a powerful tool in its armoury: tradition. This was an arena in which the nonconformists couldn't compete. Thus, while the nonconformists had adopted an economical form of classicism for its chapels, as in the example you see here, the Church of England could emphasise its presence by a Gothic building. Gothic was an explicit reference to tradition, and this, more than anything else, I would argue, encouraged the Church of England to adopt Gothic, especially after Waterloo in 1815, when church building really moved into a higher gear. And Gothic might also be seen as a patriotic style during and after the wars with France. Thus, a conspicuous Gothic church was as important for those merely walking past it as those who worshipped within it. It was a proud visual statement of Anglican confidence and Anglican presence. My next theme concerns seating. Church building was always expensive, even with stringent economies in place. Even with the stringent economies in place, the erection of something appropriately church-like was inevitably going to involve raising a substantial sum of money. Furthermore, a funding package needed not just to consider paying the builders. After all, there was no point in erecting a new church if there was no provision for ongoing expenses, such as clergy stipends, clerk salary, building maintenance, and so on. There was no central funding for any of these, and surplus fees might continue to be paid to the incumbent of the existing parish church, thus denying the curate of the new church or chapel access to a useful means of support. Aside from those rare cases of a benevolent donor or donors providing the whole or most of the cost of the new church and endowing it, pew rents were absolutely central to the viability of a proposal to erect a new place of worship. The social divisiveness in the system troubled many at the period, but there was no feasible alternative. Now, I've picked this image of St. Bride's because it very clearly demonstrates the difference between the rented pews at either side of the church and the the free seats running down the central aisle with what looked like their hard open backs. So there was a clear social division between the renters and the free seat occupiers. But pew rents really were the usual means of paying the ongoing costs. Indeed, income from pew rents might be used to service a commercial loan to fund the new building, repaid over many years. Consequently, if free seats were to be created in a church to address a desperate need among the poor, these could usually be provided only and played a central role. Here's a rare example of late 18th century seating which has survived unchanged at Wanstead in Essex. And again, the difference between the free seats with the backless free seats tucked into the corner of the gallery and the seats to the left of the image, the rented seats with their doors, is fairly obvious. And we must not forget that most nonconformist chapels also had many rented seats. This is a satirical print, but it shows graphically the difference between not only those in the rented pews on the extreme left and those having to sit on benches, or indeed having to stand through the whole service. And this was a situation which existed in many churches. Thus, in this period, worshippers were somewhat segregated between middle-class pew renters and the poor placed on free benches or having to stand. There might even be different doors through which the different classes entered. Here at St. Luke in West Norwood, you could see 5 doors across the front, each leading to a separate part of the church, rather like those entering a theatre. However, the late Georgians fully understood the unfortunate side effects of this segregation. Indeed, there were numerous letters to journals regretting the segregation and calling for all classes to be joined together in the sight of God. Now, seating naturally leads us on to galleries. Given the need to accommodate the maximum number of worshippers so that all could hear and see, galleries must always have seemed eminently sensible. Galleries hugely increased the number of seats, many of which were close to the pulpit, and those occupying them could hear well. But why stop at just one level of galleries? Indeed, many late Georgian churches had two levels of galleries, one above another. Almost all of these upper galleries were removed, but here at St Marylebone, part of the upper gallery still survives. Originally, the upper gallery ran all the way along the north and south walls above the first gallery, which is still there. However, even for the practically minded late Georgians, upper galleries were widely seen as a step too far, in that they gave the church, I quote, too much the appearance of the theatre. This was a criticism that we found well before the birth of ecclesiology. For instance, in 1835, the critic W.H. Leeds complained of St Philip Regent Street, where there were double galleries on three sides. He complained that they rose, and I quote, in tiers one above another, and created a disagreeable resemblance to playhouse architecture. My next theme concerns church-going. An exploration of late Georgian churches inevitably introduces us to the fascinating lost world of the period's church-going. My book seeks to explore what worshippers expected and experienced. How did they use their church, and what messages was the building expected to convey? The subject of late Georgian churches also brings us into contact with a range of roles that have entirely disappeared. For instance, most town churches would have a beadle or beadles who maintained order amongst the more rowdy members of the congregation, and especially among the huge numbers of children that attended the services. Indeed, sometimes whole galleries were given over to children, and the ensuing noise must have been often horrendous. And to make the middle-class pew renters feel more comfortable, there were pew openers who were almost always female and who, for a small tip, would escort the congregants to their rented pew and see them comfortably seated. And there were sellers of tickets to visitors who appear to have served a significant demand. Especially in places of resort like Brighton or Bath, the selling of visitors' tickets was quite an industry. Additionally, my text reveals a form of worship where a salaried clerk led much of the service. And this again is a satirical print, but you can see in sorry, where's the arrow? We just use the mouse. Yeah, right. So we've got the three-decker pulpit. Here's the clergyman in the reading desk, but below him is the clerk, either leading the prayers or the singing at this this part of the service. Where's my place? The role of the clerk was one almost entirely dispensed with by the Victorians, but clerks played an essential role in late Georgian worship. Now, what did he do? Well, he read the notices, often read the lessons, led the congregation in the formal spoken responses in the liturgy, and also led the singing of psalms and hymns. The scholar Bill Jacob likened his role to that of the cathedral presenter, leading the choral parts of the service and suggesting a position of importance and dignity. However, sometimes the clerk sang ineptly and spoke for the congregation, thus allowing the congregation to remain largely silent and implying an element of indifference from them. This was a regular Victorian criticism of his role. Also significant in this period were the civic churches. In the larger towns, one of the churches would be deemed the civic church. It would receive grants from civic funds determined by the corporation, and the church would provide prominent seats for the holders of specific positions in the town, such as the mayor, members of the congregation, and judges. While there were objections to ostentatious private pews, elaborate civic pews seem to have escaped criticism. They were more often to be found in the old churches, but some were rebuilt, as for instance at Preston and Leeds, or in Liverpool, where the corporation decided to fund a new civic church regardless of expense. Those in Leeds, which you see here, are a rare survival. And what's church music in the period? To lead or perhaps replace congregational singing, many a town church had a competent adult choir comprising men and women who might be paid for their services. Typically, they led worship during morning prayer and evening prayer. In some churches, the choir sang an anthem during each Sunday service, and in places, a choir of professional musicians might be engaged to perform parts of oratorios for affluent congregations. Alternatively, there might be a visit from a local secular choir on a specific Sunday. Significantly, in the context of the exclusively male church choirs increasingly favoured after 1840, late Georgian church choirs relied heavily on women. Indeed, Warrington, the choir was entirely female. Elsewhere, the diarist Benjamin Newton notes choirs where the majority of singers were female, and Reverend Skinner recorded his satisfaction at the singing of a choir of village girls one Sunday. An interesting question is this: what happened to all these enthusiastic female vocalists as ecclesiology tightened its grip on the established church and demanded all male choirs? Did the women accept their dismissal quietly? Unfortunately, we simply do not know. For my last theme, I want to return to the issue of the period's Gothic churches and offer some new thinking on this contested subject. In many ways, I think this is one of the most interesting issues covered in my research. Specifically, I want to consider the question of, were the late Georgian architects really incompetent where Gothic was concerned? The principle, past that one. This is a particularly grand late Georgian Gothic church, but it could never be mistaken for either a medieval one or indeed a Victorian one. There's something specifically late Georgian about it. Now, one of the reasons why the late Georgian architects developed a modern form of Gothic was not because they didn't understand the real thing, but because their clients and worshippers very rarely wanted the real thing. Remember, the forms of a medieval church had evolved for Roman Catholic worship, while a late Georgian church was carefully planned for contemporary Anglican auditory worship. A modern Gothic church might reference a medieval one, but it needed to be unquestionably Protestant, in the same way that a late Georgian classical church could take elements from a specific Greek or Roman temple, but still obviously be a building for Christian, not pagan worship. Late Georgian architects are no difficult in producing in both proportion and detail classical columns or Gothic windows. Indeed, if Pugin's mocking claim that a typical jobbing architect could design a Moorish fish market one day and an Egyptian marine villa the next, why should any architect have struggled to copy in its entirety some English country church? Well, the reason they didn't copy English country churches was because, on a practical level, good sight and sound were paramount in auditory worship, as I've explained, and thus the congregation needed to be near the minister. A well-designed late Georgian church was, as William White neatly observed in his 2017 book, paraphrasing Le Corbusier, I quote, "a machine for listening in." In this context, copying any medieval church was unlikely to have produced a viable design. Here, at a church in York that you'll all be familiar with, you couldn't possibly have fitted galleries because the nave arcade is just too low. And you couldn't expect 2,000 or more worshippers in a late Georgian church to come and go through a single door in a south porch. It would have taken longer to get in and out of the church than the duration of the service. Far better that you had 5 or perhaps even 7 doors into different parts of the church for easy entrance and exit. How best to light a church that was essentially a two-storey building, a ground floor and gallery. Well, the obvious solution was to have two tiers of windows. This example in Bristol is a particularly good example of something that could be never be mistaken for a medieval church. But in terms of lighting the interior, the two levels of windows which you see here was actually very efficient. And my final point in this part is that substantial, correctly proportioned nave columns would have been an impediment to the transfer of sound to the furthest seats. Now, the example on the left, St Lawrence in Pudsey, was a church which was particularly admired for its Gothic authenticity. But it was also a church which had a hopeless acoustic because of the massive Gothic columns of stone. Huge chunks of the congregation were stuck behind a column and could neither see nor hear. Far better that was the example on the right, where the columns are very slender and almost nobody is stuck behind one. But of course, the Victorians would criticise a church like Tynemouth because the columns were not authentic. And in this example, particularly interesting, if you look at this is the pulpit here, and if you look at these dotted lines coming down here, it shows specifically being put in by the architect to show how many people, unfortunately, were going to be put behind a column and therefore not be able to see at all and probably not hear well either. So you can see the point I'm making is that there's lots of good reason why the late Georgian churches or the late Georgian architects didn't simply go out and copy a medieval church. The arrangement of undisputedly correct Gothic with the ecclesiologists in 1840 required a careful reproduction of medieval examples. This certainly represented a shift in the centre of gravity of English stylistic thinking. And it also encouraged or indeed demanded that architects copy from the past, which is something that late Georgian architects, regardless of the style they were using, had been trained not to do. They'd been encouraged to adapt the styles of the past, develop them into something new, not merely copying. So finally, we return to the question of, were the architects, the pre-1840 architects, did they really understand Gothic? Well, the ease with which the best of them adopted the new post-1840 imperatives confirms that such authenticity could easily have been produced before 1840 had the paymasters required it. One only has to look at the work of Charles Barry, G.G. Scott, R.D. Chantrell, or Rickman's former partner, R.C. Hussey. And in fact, here in this example from Skipton, you can see a church well before 1840, which had everything that the ecclesiologists would soon be demanding. This really was well ahead of the game. And here, a much admired church from the 1840s by G.G. Scott. Now, Scott had been designing churches for 20 years. And if anybody had asked him to design a church like this in, say, 1841, in 1821, not 1841, I'm sure he could have done it. But nobody asked him. They didn't want a church like this. And here, Charles Barry was another architect who designed churches in the 1820s, but very quickly adapted to the new ideas. I would argue that the mature phase of the Gothic authenticity, which appeared in the new churches after 1840, was not because the architects were any better, but because their paymasters managed to sidestep the issue of the Catholic influence in the churches which the Victorians were wanted. But the Victorians didn't bring about the Gothic revival. They were merely pushing at an open door. It's the late Georgians who had fought and won the stylistic battle where churches were concerned. And there were indeed many very fine late Georgian churches, here by Rickman and Hutchinson, who were deemed to be the best of the late Georgian Gothic architects. A terrific classical one by John Soane, or here, not too far away, Oulton on the outskirts of Leeds, another one by Rickman and Hutchison, which was much admired. And but in just go back to but in the face of ecclesiological bigotry that in places still thrives in the 21st century, balanced assessment of late Georgian churches and the architects who designed them remains problematic. Nevertheless, we need to acknowledge that pre-1840 churches housed what is, for the 21st century observer, a long vanished form of Anglican worship, the auditory service, which you see here. It was one that required a particular layout, specific stylistic messages, and in these respects, the architects performed commendably. The ecclesiologists, like all successful reformers, were energetic in their condemnation of their predecessors, but to continue this line of argument and dismiss half a century of late Georgian church building is surely naive. It overlooks a very specific form of Anglican worship and some remarkable architectural achievements, literally hundreds of churches, the best of which deserve to be studied, enjoyed, and celebrated. So that's the end of my talk. I'm very happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. And a plug for my book, if any of you are interested, if you jot down John at John Hudson Publishing's email address, you can order a reduced price copy from him.